Marcus "Thunder" Rodriguez had everything a 25-year-old boxer could want. His muscles rippled under the bright gym lights as he threw punch after punch at the heavy bag. Sweat dripped from his forehead, but his cocky smile never left his face. He was undefeated in his last 12 fights, and everyone in the downtown boxing gym knew it. The cameras were rolling that Tuesday afternoon. A local sports reporter had come to interview Marcus about his upcoming championship fight. Marcus loved the attention. He flexed his biceps for the camera and talked about how easy his next opponent would be. "I'll knock him out in the first round," he boasted, shadowboxing for effect. As the interview continued, Marcus noticed an older man sitting quietly in the corner of the gym. The man was wearing a simple security guard uniform with a name tag that read Frank. He looked to be in his 50s with graying hair and a modest build. Frank was eating a simple sandwich during his lunch break, minding his own business. Marcus's eyes lit up with mischief. He had always been the type to show off, especially when cameras were around. "Hey, look at this guy," Marcus said to the reporter, pointing directly at Frank. "He probably thinks he's tough because he wears a uniform." The reporter seemed uncomfortable, but Marcus was just getting started. He walked over to Frank, the camera following behind him. "What do you say, old man? Think you could last one round with Thunder Rodriguez?" Marcus flexed again, making sure the camera caught every angle. Frank looked up from his sandwich calmly. His weathered face showed no emotion. "I'm just trying to eat my lunch, son," he said quietly. But Marcus wasn't done. "Come on, don't be shy. I bet you were never even in a real fight. Security guards just stand around all day, right?" He laughed loudly, playing up to the camera. "I could probably knock you out with one hand tied behind my back." The few other people in the gym stopped what they were doing. Some looked embarrassed by Marcus's behavior. Others seemed curious about what would happen next. Frank carefully wrapped up the rest of his sandwich and stood up slowly. Even standing, he was several inches shorter than Marcus. "Son, I really don't want any trouble," Frank said in the same calm voice. "I'm just here to do my job and eat my lunch in peace." Marcus turned to the camera with a huge grin. "See what I mean? These guys talk big when they're hiding behind a badge, but when it comes to real action, they back down. That's the difference between a real fighter and a wannabe." The reporter tried to change the subject back to the upcoming fight, but Marcus was having too much fun. "Tell you what, old-timer, if you're so tough, why don't you show us what you've got? Just a little friendly sparring. What could it hurt?" Frank sighed deeply. "I really don't think that's a good idea." "Of course you don't," Marcus laughed. "Because you know you'd get embarrassed on camera. Don't worry, I understand. Not everyone can be a real fighter like me." The other gym members were getting uncomfortable. The gym owner, Tony Castellanos, was in the back office and hadn't seen what was happening yet. Frank looked around the room and saw all the eyes on him. The camera was still rolling, capturing every moment of his apparent humiliation. "Look, son," Frank said, his voice still steady. "I've been doing this job for a long time. I've seen all kinds of people, and I've learned that the loudest ones usually have the most to prove." Marcus's smile faltered slightly. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," Frank said, picking up his lunchbox, "that real strength doesn't need to announce itself. Real fighters don't need to pick on people just trying to eat their lunch." The gym fell silent. Even Marcus seemed momentarily at a loss for words. But his ego quickly kicked back in. "Whatever, old man. Keep telling yourself that while you're checking IDs at the door tonight." Frank walked toward the exit, but Marcus called out one more time. "Hey, if you ever change your mind about that sparring match, you know where to find me. I'll try to go easy on you." As Frank reached the door, he turned back one final time. "Son, be careful what you wish for. You might just get it." With that, Frank left the gym. Marcus turned back to the camera with renewed confidence. "And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how you handle someone who tries to intimidate you. In this business, you can't show weakness to anyone." The reporter wrapped up the interview quickly after that. Clearly uncomfortable with what had just happened, Marcus continued his workout, throwing punches with extra force, still pumped up from the encounter. He had no idea that his world was about to change forever. Little did Marcus know, several people in the gym had their phones out during the confrontation. By that evening, clips of the encounter were already spreading on social media. The comments section was buzzing with opinions about the cocky boxer who had mocked an older security guard. But more importantly, Marcus had no idea who Frank really was. The quiet security guard had secrets that would soon make Marcus wish he had never opened his mouth that day. Frank Wilson drove home that evening in his old pickup truck, thinking about the encounter at the gym. His wife Sarah was already cooking dinner when he walked through the door of their modest two-bedroom house. She could tell something was bothering him. "Rough day at work?" Sarah asked, stirring a pot of soup on the stove. Frank hung up his security guard jacket and sat down at the kitchen table. "Just some young hotshot showing off for the cameras. Nothing I haven't seen before." Sarah had been married to Frank for 30 years. She knew her husband better than anyone else in the world. She also knew that Frank never talked about his past, especially not about his years before they met. There were boxes in their basement that Frank never opened, medals and photographs that he kept hidden away. "Maybe it's time you told people who you really are," Sarah said gently. Frank shook his head. "That life is over, Sarah. I'm just a security guard now, and that's fine by me. Those days are behind me." But Sarah wasn't convinced. She had watched her husband work security jobs for the past 15 years, always keeping a low profile, never causing trouble. She had seen him break up fights without throwing a single punch, using only his words and presence to calm situations down. She knew there was so much more to Frank than what people saw. Meanwhile, across town, Marcus was at his apartment watching the gym encounter on his phone. Someone had posted the video online and it already had thousands of views. Most of the comments were supportive of Marcus, calling him a savage and praising him for putting the old man in his place. Marcus felt proud as he read the positive comments. He shared the video on his own social media accounts with the caption, "This is what happens when fake tough guys meet real fighters. Stay humble or get humbled." His phone buzzed with notifications as friends and fans liked and shared the post. Marcus was enjoying every minute of his viral moment. He had no idea that some people were doing research on the security guard from the video. Back at Frank's house, his phone started ringing. The caller ID showed his old friend Detective Mike Sullivan from the police department. Mike and Frank had known each other for 20 years, ever since Frank moved to town. "Frank, you need to see something," Mike said without even saying hello. "Someone sent me a video from that gym where you work security." "Is that you getting hassled by some punk boxer?" Frank sighed. "Yeah, that's me. Kid was just showing off for the cameras. No big deal." "No big deal?" Mike's voice rose. "Frank, do you know this video is all over the internet? People are talking about it everywhere. Some folks are even trying to figure out who you are." Frank felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean, figure out who I am?" "I mean, some people don't think you're just a regular security guard. A few retired military guys are saying something about the way you handled yourself, the way you carried yourself." Frank, if someone digs deep enough... Frank knew what Mike was getting at. There were records, old newspaper clippings, military documents. If someone really wanted to find out about his past, they could do it. The question was whether anyone would care enough to look. The next morning, Frank went to work as usual. Tony Castellanos, the gym owner, pulled him aside as soon as he arrived. "Frank, I'm really sorry about what happened yesterday." Marcus was way out of line. "That kid thinks because he's got some wins under his belt, he can treat people however he wants." Frank appreciated Tony's concern, but he just wanted to put the whole thing behind him. "It's all right, Tony, I've dealt with worse." Still, it wasn't right. "I've been thinking about banning him from the gym, but he brings in a lot of business with those cameras and interviews." Frank understood the business side of things. Tony was a good man trying to make a living. "Don't worry about it on my account. I can handle myself." As the day went on, Frank noticed some of the younger fighters whispering and pointing at him. Word was getting around about the video and people were starting to take sides. Some thought Marcus was a jerk for picking on an older man. Others thought Frank should have stood up for himself. But there was one person at the gym who knew more than he was letting on. Jimmy Torino was a 70-year-old former trainer who had been in the boxing world for over 50 years. He had trained champions and worked with legends. Jimmy had been watching Frank closely ever since he started working security at the gym. That afternoon, Jimmy approached Frank during a quiet moment. "Frank, can I have a word with you?" They walked to a corner of the gym where they could talk privately. Jimmy looked Frank directly in the eyes. "I know who you are." Frank's heart started beating faster, but he kept his expression calm. "I'm just the security guard, Jimmy." Jimmy smiled and shook his head. "Frank the Ghost Wilson, 3-time Golden Gloves champion, undefeated as an amateur, turned professional in 1995 and went 23-0 before you disappeared from the boxing world." Frank felt like the walls were closing in. Jimmy, that was a long time ago. 28 years ago, to be exact. You were supposed to fight for the middleweight championship, but you vanished right before the biggest fight of your career. Everyone in the boxing world wondered what happened to you. Frank looked around the gym nervously. I had my reasons for walking away. I'm sure you did, Jimmy said. But that young punk doesn't know he just mocked one of the most naturally gifted fighters I've ever seen. And if I know, it won't be long before others figure it out too. 3 days after the gym incident, a boxing blogger named Danny Martinez was sitting in his small apartment, scrolling through social media when he came across the viral video of Marcus mocking the security guard. Danny had been covering boxing for 15 years and had an eye for details that others missed. Something about the older man in the video caught Danny's attention. It wasn't just the way Frank carried himself or how calm he remained under pressure. It was something about his stance, the way he positioned his feet, the subtle way he kept his hands ready without making it obvious. Danny paused the video and studied Frank's face carefully. There was something familiar about those features, something that nagged at his memory. He had interviewed hundreds of fighters over the years and had an excellent memory for faces. I've seen this guy before, Danny muttered to himself, rewinding the video again. Danny opened his laptop and started searching through his old interview files. He had been documenting boxing history for over a decade, collecting photographs, interview transcripts, and old newspaper clippings. Somewhere in his massive digital archive, he was sure he had seen that face. After 2 hours of searching, Danny found what he was looking for. It was a faded newspaper clipping from 1997, featuring a young boxer with an undefeated record. The headline read, "Local fighter the Ghost Wilson disappears before championship bout." Danny's hands shook as he compared the newspaper photo to screenshots from the viral video. The man was older now, his hair gray and his face weathered, but there was no doubt about it. The security guard that Marcus had mocked was Frank the Ghost Wilson, one of the most promising boxers of the 1990s. Holy shit, Danny whispered, his mind racing with the possibilities. Danny immediately started researching everything he could find about Frank Wilson's boxing career. The records were impressive. Frank had gone undefeated as an amateur, winning 3 Golden Gloves championships. As a professional, he had a perfect 23-0 record with 19 knockouts. He was scheduled to fight for the WBA middleweight championship in March 1997, but he never showed up for the fight. The boxing world had been stunned. Frank Wilson had simply vanished without explanation. There were rumors and speculation, but no one ever found out what really happened. Some said he had gambling debts. Others thought he was afraid of the champion. A few people believed he had been forced out by corrupt promoters. But Frank himself had never spoken publicly about his disappearance. Danny knew he had stumbled onto the story of a lifetime. He started making phone calls to old contacts in the boxing world, asking if anyone remembered Frank the Ghost Wilson. His first call was to Eddie Ramos, a veteran boxing promoter who had been around since the 1980s. "Eddie, do you remember a fighter named Frank Wilson from the 90s? They called him the Ghost?" Eddie's voice immediately perked up. "Frank Wilson? Of course I remember him. That kid was special, Danny. I mean, really special. He had this way of making you miss by just a few inches, like he could see your punch coming before you even threw it. That's why they called him the Ghost. He was there 1 second and gone the next. What happened to him? Why did he disappear right before the championship fight?" Eddie was quiet for a moment. "Nobody knows for sure, but I heard some things. Word was that his family was threatened. Some very bad people wanted him to throw fights, and when Frank refused, they went after the people he loved. Frank chose his family over boxing, and honestly, I respect him for that." Danny felt his heart racing. This story was getting bigger by the minute. "Eddie, what if I told you Frank Wilson is working as a security guard at a gym downtown and some young boxer just humiliated him on camera?" I'd say that young boxer has no idea how lucky he is that Frank Wilson is a better man now than he was a fighter. Because if Frank ever decided to step back in the ring, even at his age, he could probably still teach most of these modern fighters a lesson they'd never forget. Danny's next call was to Maria Santos, a respected boxing journalist who had covered the sport for major magazines. "Maria, I need to ask you about Frank the Ghost Wilson." "Frank Wilson?" Maria sounded surprised. "Now that's a name I haven't heard in years. What's your interest in him?" Danny explained about the viral video and his discovery. Maria was silent for a long time after he finished. "Danny, if that's really Frank Wilson, You need to be very careful about how you handle this story. Frank didn't just walk away from boxing. He walked away from everything. There were some very dangerous people involved in his situation back then. Some of those people might still be around. What kind of dangerous people? The kind that don't forgive and don't forget. Frank was supposed to be a sure thing in that championship fight. A lot of money was riding on the outcome. When he disappeared, some very powerful people lost a lot of cash. If they found out where Frank is now, Danny felt a chill run down his spine, but his journalistic instincts were stronger than his fear. This was the kind of story that could make his career. Maria, I have to write this story. The boxing world deserves to know what happened to one of the greatest talents of the 90s. Just be careful, Danny, and maybe give Frank a heads up before you publish anything. The man deserves that much. After hanging up with Maria, Danny sat back in his chair and thought about his next move. He had enough information to write a compelling article about the mystery of Frank the Ghost Wilson and his current life as a security guard. But he wanted to hear Frank's side of the story. The question was, would Frank be willing to talk? And more importantly, what would happen to Frank if his location became public knowledge? Danny looked at the viral video one more time, focusing on Marcus Rodriguez's cocky smile as he mocked the older man. Marcus had no idea he had just insulted a boxing legend, but soon everyone would know the truth. Danny opened a new document on his computer and started typing. The security guard, who could have been champion. The Frank, the Ghost, Wilson story. Danny Martinez spent the entire weekend writing his article about Frank Wilson. He wanted to get every detail right, every quote perfect. This wasn't just another boxing story. This was the revelation of one of the sport's greatest mysteries. On Monday morning, Danny called the gym where Frank worked security. Tony Castellanos answered the phone. Hi, this is Danny Martinez from Boxing Truth magazine. I'd like to speak with your security guard, Frank Wilson, about a story I'm writing. Tony was immediately suspicious. What kind of story? Frank's a good guy who minds his own business. He doesn't need reporters bothering him. Mr. Castellanos, I think Frank might want to hear what I have to say. Could you please just ask him to call me? Tell him it's about his boxing career. Tony was confused. Boxing career? Frank's never mentioned being a boxer. After Tony hung up, he went straight to Frank's office. Frank, there's some reporter who wants to talk to you about your boxing career. What boxing career? You never told me you used to box. Frank's face went pale. He had been dreading this moment for days, ever since Jimmy had recognized him. What was the reporter's name? Danny Martinez from some boxing magazine. Frank, what's going on? Frank sat down heavily in his chair. Tony, I need to make a phone call. Can you give me some privacy? Frank dialed Danny's number with shaking hands. Danny answered on the first ring. Mr. Wilson, thank you for calling. I know who you are, and I think it's time the world knew too. What do you want? Frank asked quietly. I want to tell your story. The real story of why Frank the Ghost Wilson walked away from boxing at the height of his career. I want to tell people about the greatest fighter they never got to see become champion. Frank was quiet for a long moment. If you publish that story, you could put my family in danger. Mr. Wilson, that video of you being mocked by Marcus Rodriguez has been seen by millions of people. Others are going to figure out who you are eventually. Wouldn't you rather control the narrative? Frank knew Danny was right. It was only a matter of time before someone else connected the dots. If I agree to an interview, I want your word that you won't publish anything that could put my wife in harm's way. You have my word, Mr. Wilson. But I think people deserve to know what boxing lost when you disappeared. They agreed to meet that evening at a diner outside of town. Frank spent the rest of the day thinking about what he would say, how much of the truth he was willing to reveal. At 7 o'clock, Frank walked into Murphy's Diner and found Danny sitting in a corner booth. Danny was younger than Frank had expected, maybe in his mid-30s, with the eager look of someone who knew they were sitting on a big story. Mr. Wilson, thank you for coming. I've been researching your career for the past week. You were incredible to watch. Frank slid into the booth across from Danny. That was a long time ago. I'm a different person now. Danny pulled out a digital recorder. Do you mind if I record this? I want to make sure I get your quotes exactly right. Frank nodded and Danny pressed record. Let's start at the beginning. You were 23 neo as a professional boxer, scheduled to fight Carlos Mendoza for the WBA middleweight championship on March 15, 1997. 3 days before the fight, you vanished. Where did you go? Frank stared out the window for a moment before answering. I went home to protect my family. From who? There were some people who wanted me to lose that fight. They had bet big money against me and they needed a sure thing. When I refused to cooperate, they made it clear that my wife would pay the price. Danny leaned forward. Who were these people? I can't give you names. Some of them might still be around and I won't risk Sarah's safety for a story. Fair enough. But you could have gone to the police, the boxing commission, someone. Frank laughed bitterly. You think I didn't try? These weren't street thugs, Danny. These were people with connections, people with power. The police told me they needed evidence, and by the time I could get evidence, my wife might have been dead. So you just walked away from everything. I walked away from boxing. I kept everything that mattered. Danny asked about Frank's training, his fighting style, his dreams of being champion. Frank answered honestly, and Danny could hear the pain in his voice. This wasn't a man who had wanted to quit. This was a man who had been forced to choose between his career and his family. Do you ever regret the decision? Danny asked. Frank thought for a moment. I regret that I never got to find out how good I really was. I regret that boxing fans never got to see some of the fights I could have given them, but I don't regret choosing Sarah. I'd make the same choice again. What about Marcus Rodriguez? What did you think when he mocked you in front of those cameras? For the first time during the interview, Frank smiled. I thought he was a young man who had confused muscles with strength. Real strength isn't about how hard you can hit. It's about knowing when not to hit at all. But you could have easily handled him, couldn't you? Frank's smile widened slightly. Danny, I'm 53 years old. I haven't thrown a serious punch in over 25 years. Marcus is a young, strong, trained fighter. It wouldn't be fair. Wouldn't be fair to who? Frank looked directly at Danny. It wouldn't be fair to Marcus. The interview continued for another hour. Danny asked about Frank's current life, his job as a security guard, his relationship with his wife. Frank answered most questions, but he was careful not to reveal too much about his location or daily routine. As they prepared to leave, Danny had one final question. Mr. Wilson, is there anything you want to say to Marcus Rodriguez? Frank considered the question carefully. I'd tell him to be humble. Talent is a gift, but character is a choice. He's young. He's got time to learn. I hope he makes better choices than he did that day in the gym. Danny published his article 3 days later. The headline read, The Ghost Returns: The True Story of Boxing's Greatest Mystery. Within hours of publication, the article was being shared across every boxing website and social media platform. The boxing world was stunned. Frank the Ghost Wilson, the man who could have been champion, was alive and working as a security guard. The same man that Marcus Rodriguez had mocked on camera was a former undefeated professional boxer who had walked away from millions of dollars to protect his family. Marcus Rodriguez woke up that morning to hundreds of notifications on his phone. The viral video that had made him famous for mocking an old security guard now looked very different. People weren't praising Marcus anymore. They were calling him an idiot for disrespecting a boxing legend. Marcus Rodriguez's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. It was 6 in the morning, and he had already received over 300 notifications. At first he thought it was more praise for the viral video of him putting the security guard in his place, but as he started reading the messages, his stomach dropped. Dude, you mocked Frank the Ghost Wilson? Are you insane? You just disrespected a boxing legend, you idiot. That old security guard could have been heavyweight champion. You're finished. Marcus sat up in bed, his heart racing. He quickly Googled Frank Wilson boxer and found Danny Martinez's article. As he read about Frank's undefeated record, his 3 Golden Gloves championships, and his mysterious disappearance before the championship fight, Marcus felt sick. The man he had mocked and humiliated on camera wasn't just some random security guard. He was Frank the Ghost Wilson, one of the most promising boxers of the 1990s. A man who had walked away from millions of dollars in championship glory to protect his family. Marcus's social media accounts were being flooded with angry comments. People were calling him disrespectful, arrogant, and stupid. The video that had made him feel like a star just a week ago was now destroying his reputation. His manager, Steve Kowalski, called him at 7 in the morning. Marcus, what the hell did you do? My phone hasn't stopped ringing. Every boxing website in the country is talking about how you disrespected Frank Wilson. Steve, I had no idea who he was. He was just some old guy in a security uniform. How was I supposed to know he used to be a famous boxer? That's exactly the problem, Marcus. You didn't know, but you assumed. You made fun of a man without knowing anything about him, and now the entire boxing world thinks you're a disrespectful punk. Marcus's upcoming championship fight was suddenly in jeopardy. His opponent's team was already using the incident to paint Marcus as an arrogant bully who didn't respect the sport's history. Boxing fans were turning against him, and sponsors were starting to have second thoughts. Steve, what do I do? How do I fix this? You need to apologize, Marcus. Publicly and sincerely, and you need to do it fast. Meanwhile, Frank was dealing with his own problems. The article had brought him the kind of attention he had spent 25 years trying to avoid. Reporters were calling the gym constantly, asking for interviews. Boxing fans were showing up at his workplace hoping to meet the legendary Ghost. Worse, Frank was worried about the dangerous people from his past. If they read the article and discovered where he was working, Sarah could be in danger all over again. That afternoon, Frank received an unexpected visitor at the gym. Marcus Rodriguez walked through the front door looking nervous and uncomfortable. The other gym members stopped what they were doing and stared as Marcus approached Frank's security desk. "Mr. Wilson, could I speak with you privately?" Marcus asked, his voice much quieter than it had been during their first encounter. Frank studied the young man's face. Marcus looked genuinely distressed, his cocky demeanor completely gone. "All right, but make it quick. I'm working." They walked to a quiet corner of the gym. Marcus took a deep breath before speaking. "Mr. Wilson, I read the article about you. I had no idea who you were, and I want to apologize for how I acted." Frank nodded but didn't say anything. "I was showing off for the cameras, trying to look tough. I thought you were just some regular security guard, and I figured making fun of you would make me look cool. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." Frank could see that Marcus was genuinely remorseful, but he also sensed that the apology was motivated by damage control rather than real understanding. "Marcus, do you think my boxing career is what makes disrespecting me wrong?" Marcus looked confused. "What do you mean?" "I mean, would it have been okay to mock me if I really was just a regular security guard with no boxing background? Would it have been acceptable to humiliate an older man trying to eat his lunch if he didn't have 23 professional wins?" Marcus realized what Frank was getting at, and he felt even worse. "No, sir. It would have been wrong either way." "That's right. The problem wasn't that you didn't know who I was. The problem is how you treat people, period. My boxing career doesn't make me more deserving of respect than any other person doing an honest job." Marcus nodded, beginning to understand the deeper lesson Frank was teaching him. "You want to know what real strength is, Marcus? Real strength is treating everyone with dignity, regardless of whether they can help your career or not. Real strength is building people up instead of tearing them down." "You're right, Mr. Wilson. I've been acting like a jerk, not just to you, but to a lot of people. I thought being undefeated made me special. But I can see now that winning fights doesn't mean anything if you lose your character." Frank could see that Marcus was starting to get it, but he knew words were easy. "Marcus, apologies are nice, but actions matter more. If you really want to make this right, you need to change how you carry yourself. In the ring and out of it, how do I do that?" Frank thought for a moment. "First, you make a real public apology. Not just to me, but to everyone who saw that video. You take responsibility for your actions without making excuses. And then you prove through your behavior that you've learned something. You treat everyone with respect from the janitor to the championship belt holder. You remember that boxing is just what you do, not who you are." Marcus spent the next hour talking with Frank. The older man shared stories about his boxing career, but more importantly, he talked about the values that had guided his life: respect, humility, family, and integrity. Things that couldn't be won in a boxing ring but had to be earned through daily choices. When Marcus finally left the gym, he felt different. The conversation with Frank had been more valuable than any training session he'd ever had. He understood now that he had work to do, not just on his boxing skills, but on becoming a better man. The next day, Marcus held a press conference. With cameras rolling and reporters watching, he offered a heartfelt apology to Frank Wilson and to anyone who had been affected by his disrespectful behavior. "I made a mistake," Marcus said, looking directly into the camera. "I acted like a bully, and there's no excuse for that. Frank Wilson didn't deserve to be treated that way, and neither would anyone else. I'm going to work on being a better person, not just a better boxer, But the damage to Marcus's reputation was already done. His championship fight was postponed while the boxing commission reviewed his conduct. Several sponsors pulled out of their deals with him. His social media following, which had grown after the original viral video, began to shrink as fans lost interest in a fighter known more for his arrogance than his skills. 6 months after the viral video incident, Frank Wilson's life had changed dramatically. The article about his boxing career had brought him recognition he never wanted, but it had also brought him opportunities he never expected. Boxing gyms across the country were offering him training positions. Documentary filmmakers wanted to tell his story. Publishers were interested in his autobiography. But Frank had turned down every offer, preferring to keep his quiet life as a security guard. However, there was one request that made him reconsider his position. The local youth center had called, asking if he would be willing to teach boxing to at-risk teenagers. The program was designed to keep kids off the streets and give them a positive outlet for their energy. These kids need role models, explained Patricia Martinez, the youth center director. They need to see someone who chose integrity over money, family over fame. Your story could change lives, Mr. Wilson. Frank discussed it with Sarah that evening over dinner. What do you think? It would just be a few hours a week teaching kids the basics. Sarah smiled at her husband. Frank, you've been hiding your talents for 25 years. Maybe it's time to use them for something good. The next week, Frank started his first boxing class at the Martinez Youth Center. 15 teenagers ages 14 to 18 showed up.